You don't belong in that chair.
"Oh, you don't belong in that chair, you activist bitch," Captain David Rodriguez screamed, before punching Judge Patricia Williams hard in the face, right there in open court. But that punch instantly became the beginning of the end for a career built on corruption and cover-ups. This wasn't just an assault on a black judge. It was the moment someone finally pushed too far in front of the wrong person. Rodriguez had no idea the woman he just attacked had been quietly reviewing files that certain people desperately wanted to stay buried forever, including financial records about cases that destroyed families and covered up systematic police brutality through million-dollar bribes. What started as a routine police misconduct hearing became the spark that would ignite a federal investigation, exposing corruption at the highest levels. Watch till the end, because this time when the system tried to protect its own corrupt officials, the whole foundation cracked. And what came next changed everything for those who thought buying silence was acceptable. The most harsh shadows through the tall windows of Courtroom 6A in the Riverside County Superior Court, where families had gathered seeking justice for their most vulnerable. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating worn wooden benches that had witnessed decades of legal battles. But this Tuesday morning would be different. This would be the day when 12 years of systematic corruption would finally explode in the face of the wrong person. Judge Patricia Williams adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the case file that had been keeping her awake for 4 nights straight. The document in her hands seemed routine at first glance. A police misconduct hearing involving 16-year-old Tanya Morrison, an honor student who had been brutally beaten by 3 officers during what they described as a routine traffic stop. The incident report, typed in clinical language, described a child who had allegedly displayed aggressive resistance and threatened officer safety through non-compliance. But Judge Williams had learned to read between the lines of police reports, especially those bearing the signature of Captain David Rodriguez, head of Internal Affairs for Riverside County. At 52 years old, with 28 years of judicial experience behind her, she had developed an instinct for recognizing patterns that others preferred to ignore. Rodriguez's name had been appearing in connection with resolved cases with disturbing frequency, always involving black families, always with mysterious withdrawals of complaints, always with language that criminalized normal responses to police aggression. Tanya sat in the front row, her left arm still in a cast from the encounter 3 months earlier, her young face bearing the careful composure of someone who had learned that survival often depended on making herself invisible. Her mother, Angela Morrison, kept one protective hand on her daughter's shoulder while clutching a manila folder with her free hand. The folder contained medical records documenting 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and psychological trauma from an encounter that had started when Tanya was walking home from her job at the local library. The courtroom door opened with deliberate force, brass hinges protesting under the weight of Captain David Rodriguez's entrance. At 6'1", with the solid build that came from years of administrative power, Rodriguez filled the doorway like a man stepping onto his own personal stage. His dress uniform was pressed to military precision, the weight of his ceremonial weapons and rank insignia creating the distinctive swagger of someone who had never been seriously challenged by civilian authority. Rodriguez's pale gray eyes swept the courtroom with practiced assessment, lingering on Tanya with the cold evaluation of someone who viewed teenage trauma as acceptable collateral damage. When his gaze shifted to Judge Williams, something flickered across his expression. Not quite disrespect, not yet, but the subtle challenge of a man who viewed black women in positions of authority as temporary obstacles rather than legitimate threats. But Judge Williams had been building a federal case against Rodriguez for 8 months. The tension in courtroom 6A was palpable as Rodriguez approached the witness stand with the casual arrogance of someone who had made dozens of police problems disappear over the past decade. His reputation preceded him. They called him the Fixer, the man who could turn brutal assaults into administrative oversights, who could transform murdered children into justified homicides with the stroke of a pen. Judge Williams observed this performance with the steady composure of someone who had spent decades watching corrupt officials assert their dominance through body language and barely concealed contempt. She had seen this particular brand of arrogance before, had learned to recognize the telltale signs of administrators who believed their positions granted them immunity from consequences. But what Rodriguez didn't know What he couldn't possibly have suspected as he settled into the witness chair with casual ownership was that Judge Williams had been secretly coordinating with federal investigators for months. Hidden in her private files was a collection of evidence that would destroy not just his career, but the entire network of corruption that had protected killer cops throughout his tenure as head of internal affairs. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than intimidation, "please describe your department's investigation into the Morrison incident." Rodriguez leaned back slightly in the witness chair, a gesture that would have been subtle if not for the context. In a courtroom where respect for judicial authority was foundational, even small displays of casual disregard carried significant weight. "Your Honor, Internal Affairs conducted a thorough investigation into the allegations made by the Morrison family. We found that the officers involved acted within department guidelines and used appropriate force given the subject's resistance." Judge Williams made a careful note, her pen moving deliberately across the legal pad, while her mind processed the familiar euphemisms. Subject's resistance was Rodriguez's preferred term for what civilian observers might describe as a teenage girl crying for help while being beaten unconscious by 3 grown men. "And what evidence did your investigation uncover to support the officer's version of events?" Rodriguez's confidence flickered slightly. Perhaps he had expected the usual perfunctory questions that allowed him to deliver his prepared statements without challenge. "The officer's incident reports were consistent and professionally documented. We also had witness statements supporting their account of events." "Witness statements from whom?" "Fellow officers who observed the incident, as well as civilian witnesses who confirmed the subject's aggressive behavior." Judge Williams set down her pen and looked directly at Rodriguez, her dark eyes meeting his pale ones with unwavering composure. "Captain Rodriguez, are you aware that Ms. Morrison's encounter was recorded by multiple security cameras in the area?" The question hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Rodriguez looked genuinely uncomfortable. His hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of the witness chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your Honor, if such recordings existed, they would have been reviewed as part of our investigation." "They do exist, Captain. In fact, I have them in my possession." Judge Williams gestured toward her court administrator, who began setting up a laptop computer connected to the courtroom's large monitor. "What the court is about to see is security footage from 3 different angles, showing the entire encounter between your officers and Miss Morrison." Rodriguez's face had gone pale, understanding that whatever was on those recordings would either vindicate his investigation or destroy it completely. "Your Honor, if recordings exist that weren't part of the official investigation, I would question their authenticity and chain of custody." "The recordings were provided directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Captain Rodriguez. They've been authenticated and verified. Would you like to review them with the court?" The words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation," dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through everyone present. Rodriguez's confident posture collapsed as he realized that his carefully constructed administrative fortress was about to be demolished by federal oversight. But the FBI footage was just the beginning of Rodriguez's nightmare. The courtroom monitor flickered to life, displaying high-definition security footage that made Rodriguez's administrative reports look like deliberate fiction. The timestamp showed a date 3 months earlier, and the location was clearly identifiable as the intersection of 5th and Maple, where Tanya Morrison had been walking home from her library job. The video began with crystal-clear footage of Tanya Morrison walking alone on the sidewalk, earbuds in, backpack over her shoulder, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had no reason to expect trouble. She was clearly visible, small and slight, carrying a library book and what appeared to be homework, the picture of a responsible teenager heading home after work. 3 police cruisers appeared simultaneously from different directions, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested deliberate tactical positioning rather than response to any immediate threat. The lead vehicle pulled directly in front of Tanya, forcing her to stop walking, while the other 2 blocked potential escape routes. "Your Honor," Rodriguez said desperately, his voice cracking slightly, "this footage doesn't show what preceded the encounter. There may have been radio reports of suspicious activity in the area." Judge Williams consulted a document from her file. According to radio logs provided by the FBI, there were no calls for service in that area at that time, no reports of suspicious activity, no indication that Miss Morrison was anything other than a teenager walking home from work. The video continued with devastating clarity. 6 officers emerged from the 3 vehicles, their body language aggressive and confrontational as they surrounded the obviously frightened girl. The audio, enhanced by federal technicians, captured Tanya's voice, high and scared. "Officers, I don't understand. I was just walking home. I work at the library. I have my employee ID." Officer Marcus Thompson, the lead officer in the encounter, responded with immediate aggression. "Don't give me that innocent act. We know what you people are up to in this neighborhood." The phrase "you people" echoed through the courtroom speakers with chilling clarity, removing any possible ambiguity about the racial motivations behind the encounter. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps realizing that his officer's own words were destroying any possibility of justifying their actions. What happened next made everyone in the courtroom gasp in horror. The security footage showed Tanya Morrison attempting to comply with multiple contradictory commands from 6 different officers. "Put your hands up. Get on the ground. Stop moving. Turn around. Don't turn around." The commands came simultaneously, making compliance impossible and creating the exact situation that would later be described as resistance in official reports. Tanya, clearly confused and terrified, tried to follow the instructions while asking for clarification. "I'm trying to do what you're asking. Can you please tell me what I did wrong?" Officer Thompson's response was immediate and brutal. His fist connected with Tanya's face with enough force to send her sprawling to the pavement, her library books scattering across the asphalt. As she fell, the other officers joined in, kicking and striking the motionless teenager, while she curled into a defensive position, crying for help. The beating continued for nearly 3 minutes, captured in excruciating detail by multiple cameras. At no point did Tanya Morrison resist. At no point did she pose a threat. At no point did she do anything other than beg for the violence to stop, while 6 grown men took turns assaulting a child. When the officers finally stopped, Tanya Morrison was unconscious, blood pooling beneath her head, her left arm clearly broken from the angle it made against her body. The officers stood around her motionless form, discussing their story, their voices clearly audible on the enhanced audio. Subject displayed aggressive resistance and threatened officer safety, Officer Thompson said, his voice calm and professional despite the violence he had just committed. Had to use appropriate force to subdue the threat. "Agreed," another officer responded. Subject was non-compliant and combative throughout the encounter. Rodriguez's face was ashen as he watched his officers fabricate their reports in real time, creating the false narrative that he would later support through his internal affairs investigation. But Judge Williams wasn't finished exposing Rodriguez's crimes. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of documented evidence, "your investigation concluded that Miss Morrison's injuries were the result of her own resistance and that the officers acted appropriately. How do you reconcile that finding with what we just witnessed?" Rodriguez's hands were trembling now, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. "Your Honor, video footage can be misleading without proper context. Officers make split-second decisions based on threat assessment and training. Captain Rodriguez, we just watched a 3-minute assault on an unconscious child. What split-second decision justifies continuing to beat someone who is motionless and bleeding?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Rodriguez opened his mouth, but no words came out. What defense could he offer against the clarity of documented evidence? What justification could survive the brutal honesty of federal surveillance footage? Judge Williams pulled another document from her file, this one bearing FBI letterhead and classification stamps. "Captain Rodriguez, what you may not realize is that your Internal Affairs Department has been under federal surveillance for 18 months. The Morrison case isn't an aberration. It's part of a pattern that federal investigators have been documenting systematically." Rodriguez was about to discover that his entire career was built on crimes the FBI had been watching him commit. Judge Williams opened a thick manila folder that had been sitting discreetly beside her bench throughout the hearing. The folder bore official FBI seals and evidence tags, marking it as part of an ongoing federal investigation that Rodriguez was only now learning existed. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a carefully prepared presentation. Federal investigators have identified 73 cases of police misconduct that passed through your Internal Affairs Department over the past 5 years. In every single case, your investigation found the officers' actions justified, regardless of the severity of the incident or the strength of evidence against them. Rodriguez's face cycled through expressions of surprise, calculation, and dawning panic as he processed the scope of federal oversight that had been operating without his knowledge. Your Honor, I don't know what kind of statistical analysis the FBI has conducted, but Internal Affairs investigates every complaint thoroughly and objectively. Thoroughly and objectively, Judge Williams repeated slowly. That's interesting phrasing, Captain, because federal investigators have also identified a rather remarkable financial pattern connected to these resolved cases. She gestured toward her court administrator, who projected a new document onto the courtroom monitor. The image showed a detailed financial analysis, complete with bank records, deposit patterns, and correlation charts that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning years. What the court is seeing, Judge Williams explained, is a financial audit of your personal banking records, conducted with proper federal warrants and oversight. Over the past 5 years, you've received approximately $1 million in deposits that don't correspond to your official salary or any legitimate income source. The numbers appeared on screen with devastating clarity. Deposits of $25,000, $50,000, sometimes as much as $75,000, always within days of Internal Affairs, closing problematic cases without disciplinary action. The pattern was undeniable. Rodriguez was being paid to make police misconduct disappear. These deposits, Judge Williams continued, correspond almost perfectly with the resolution of cases involving serious police misconduct. The more severe the incident, the larger the payment. The more public attention a case received, the more money changed hands. Rodriguez was gripping the armrests of his witness chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Your Honor, I don't know what kind of conspiracy theory this is supposed to prove, but I've never accepted bribes or compromised any investigation. Then perhaps you can explain these audio recordings, Judge Williams said, nodding toward her court administrator who loaded another file. Conversations between you and representatives from various private security companies, bail bond businesses, and legal firms that specialize in defending police misconduct cases. The first recording began to play, and Rodriguez's voice filled the courtroom with damning clarity. The audio quality was crystal clear, obviously recorded through professional federal surveillance equipment. Rodriguez's voice was unmistakable as he discussed the Morrison case with someone identified as Marcus Chen, a representative from Riverside Security Solutions. The Morrison situation is getting complicated, Rodriguez's recorded voice said, slightly distorted but clearly audible. The family is pushing for a civil rights investigation, and there's talk of federal oversight. This one's going to cost more than usual. Chen's voice responded with casual calculation. How much are we talking about? The standard rate for a violent encounter like this is $50,000, but if federal attention is involved, we might need to go higher. 75 should cover it, Rodriguez replied. I can make sure the investigation finds procedural compliance and justified force. The family will get the message that pursuing this further isn't in their best interests. And the officers involved? They'll receive additional training and counseling, which looks good for public relations, but doesn't impact their careers. Everyone wins except the family, and they're not in a position to complain. Chen laughed, the sound chilling in its casual cruelty. That's why we pay you the big money, Rodriguez. You make problems disappear so cleanly that nobody even knows they existed. The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting a conversation between two men who viewed the systematic abuse of civil rights as a profitable business opportunity. Rodriguez's voice could be heard describing other cases, other families, other payoffs that ensured justice would never reach the victims of police violence. In the courtroom, Rodriguez's face had gone gray as he listened to his own voice celebrating the corruption of the justice system. His earlier denials seemed pathetic now, exposed as lies by the clarity of federal surveillance technology. But the financial corruption was just one layer of Rodriguez's crimes. Judge Williams loaded another audio file. this one featuring Rodriguez in conversation with District Attorney Michael Thompson and Police Chief Robert Hayes, a conversation that revealed the institutional support structure that had enabled Rodriguez's criminal enterprise. "The problem we're facing," Rodriguez's voice said on the recording, "is that these communities are becoming more sophisticated about documenting police encounters. Every teenager has a camera phone now, and civil rights groups are teaching people to record their interactions with officers." Chief Hayes responded with institutional frustration. "We need to adapt our training and our responses. The old methods of controlling narratives aren't working when everything is being filmed. That's where internal affairs becomes crucial," Rodriguez explained. "Even when there's clear video evidence of misconduct, I can structure investigations to focus on policy compliance rather than actual wrongdoing. We emphasize officer safety, split-second decision-making, and department training protocols. The families get frustrated and give up, or they accept settlements that include non-disclosure agreements." District Attorney Thompson's voice joined the conversation. "And if they don't accept settlements? That's when our private partners become involved," Rodriguez said. "Community pressure, economic consequences, sometimes more direct forms of discouragement. Most families decide that pursuing justice isn't worth the risks involved." The recording documented a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement and judicial administration, revealing that Rodriguez's corruption was not an individual aberration, but part of a systematic effort to protect police from accountability. Rodriguez was beginning to realize that his entire world was about to collapse. As the audio recordings ended, Judge Williams opened another section of her evidence file, this one containing documents that would give names and faces to Rodriguez's systematic destruction of justice. The papers were organized with the methodical precision of federal investigators who understood that each case represented a family whose trust in the system had been betrayed. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence, "federal investigators have identified 31 families who were paid to remain silent about police misconduct cases that your department classified as justified. Would you like to hear from some of those families?" Rodriguez's eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps searching for escape routes that didn't exist. "Your Honor, I don't know what kind of testimony you're planning to present, but any allegations should be properly verified through official channels. These testimonies were collected by federal investigators with proper oversight and documentation," Judge Williams replied. "The families have been granted immunity and protection in exchange for their cooperation with the ongoing investigation." The courtroom doors opened to admit a woman in her 40s, accompanied by a teenage boy who walked with a slight limp. Judge Williams identified them as Maria Santos and her son Miguel, whose encounter with police had been resolved by Rodriguez's department 2 years earlier. Maria Santos approached the witness stand with the dignified composure of someone who had spent months finding the courage to speak truth to power. Her son remained in the gallery, but his presence served as a living reminder that Rodriguez's crimes had real victims with lasting consequences. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Williams began gently, "would you please tell the court about your family's experience with Captain Rodriguez's internal affairs investigation?" Maria Santos took a deep breath before speaking, her voice strong despite the obvious emotional weight of her testimony. 2 years ago, my son Miguel was walking home from soccer practice when he was stopped by 4 police officers. They said he matched the description of a suspect, but Miguel was wearing his school uniform and carrying his soccer equipment. It was obvious he was just a student. Her voice remained steady as she described the encounter. The officers threw Miguel to the ground and handcuffed him. When he asked what he had done wrong, they began hitting him with their batons. My son was 14 years old, 98 pounds, and he was beaten so severely that he spent 3 days in the hospital. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps recognizing the case from his files, but unable to reconcile Maria Santos's testimony with the sanitized version that had appeared in his official reports. "When I filed a complaint with Internal Affairs," Maria Santos continued, "Captain Rodriguez personally handled the investigation. He told me that the officers had acted appropriately, given my son's aggressive demeanor, and that pursuing the matter further would only cause more problems for my family." Judge Williams made notes as Maria Santos testified, each detail adding weight to the pattern of systematic corruption that was emerging. Did Captain Rodriguez offer your family any form of compensation? Yes, Maria Santos said, her voice taking on a harder edge. He said the department wanted to help with Miguel's medical expenses and therapy costs. They offered us $40,000, but only if we signed papers agreeing never to discuss the incident publicly and never to pursue any legal action against the officers or the department. The courtroom fell silent as the true cost of Rodriguez's corruption became clear. Mrs. Santos, why did you accept the settlement? Judge Williams asked gently. Maria Santos's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain and fear that had driven her family's decision. Because Captain Rodriguez made it clear that refusing the money would have consequences. He said Miguel would likely be arrested again, that our family would be subjected to additional scrutiny, that my job at the county hospital might be affected if I was seen as someone who caused problems for law enforcement. The threat was clear and devastating. Rodriguez had used his position to terrorize families into silence, turning the justice system into a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. Judge Williams gestured toward the gallery, where several other families had quietly entered during Maria Santos's testimony. Captain Rodriguez, Mrs. Santos is not alone. Federal investigators have documented similar patterns in 30 other cases involving your internal affairs investigations. One by one, family representatives stood as Judge Williams read their names. The Johnson family and son beaten unconscious during a traffic stop paid $35,000 for silence. The Williams family, daughter sexually assaulted during a bogus arrest, paid $60,000 to prevent prosecution. The Chen family, father shot in the back during a wellness check, paid $100,000 to avoid media attention. Each name represented a life destroyed, a family terrorized into accepting injustice, rather than risking further retaliation. Rodriguez had built his criminal enterprise on the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society, confident that his victims would be too afraid to speak out. But federal protection had finally given these families the courage to tell their stories. The next witness was 17-year-old Marcus Johnson, whose encounter with police had left him with permanent nerve damage in his left hand. He walked to the witness stand with the careful dignity of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, his injured hand resting in a supportive brace that would be with him for the rest of his life. Mr. Johnson, Judge Williams said softly, would you please tell the court about your experience with police officers and Captain Rodriguez's investigation? Marcus Johnson's voice was quiet but clear as he described being tasered repeatedly during an arrest for loitering outside the community center where he volunteered as a tutor. They kept tasering me even after I was handcuffed and on the ground. I was convulsing and couldn't speak, but they said I was resisting arrest. His testimony revealed the same pattern: brutal police violence followed by Rodriguez's systematic cover-up, financial pressure to remain silent, and threats of retaliation if the family pursued justice through official channels. Captain Rodriguez told my mother that I had brought the incident on myself through my attitude and behavior, Marcus Johnson said, his young voice carrying the weight of institutional betrayal. He said that continuing to complain would only mark me as a troublemaker who would face additional problems with law enforcement. Rodriguez was watching his victims testify against him with growing desperation. The final witness was Eleanor Parker, an elderly woman whose grandson had been killed during what Rodriguez's investigation had classified as a justified shooting. Her testimony would reveal the ultimate cost of Rodriguez's corruption, the families who had been paid to stay silent while their children's murderers remained free. Mrs. Parker's voice trembled with controlled rage as she described her grandson Isaiah, a 15-year-old honor student who had been shot in the back while running away from officers who suspected him of shoplifting. Captain Rodriguez told me that Isaiah had brought his death on himself by running from police. He said that pursuing a civil rights investigation would only dishonor my grandson's memory. The payoff in Isaiah's case had been the largest, $150,000, to ensure that the family would not seek federal intervention in what was clearly an unjustified killing. Rodriguez had literally put a price on a child's life, calculating that his family's grief could be purchased like any other commodity. Mrs. Parker, Judge Williams asked, what finally convinced you to cooperate with federal investigators? Eleanor Parker's answer cut through the courtroom like a blade. Because I realized that staying silent to protect one corrupt officer meant that other families would lose their children too. My grandson Isaiah died because Captain Rodriguez had been covering up police murders for years. I couldn't let his death be the price of another family's silence. The human cost of Rodriguez's crimes was finally being heard. Judge Williams called for a brief recess to allow the emotional weight of the victim testimony to settle, but when court resumed, she shifted focus to the mechanical details of Rodriguez's criminal enterprise. Federal investigators had spent months tracing financial transactions, corporate connections, and institutional relationships that revealed corruption operating on an industrial scale. Captain Rodriguez, Judge Williams said, consulting a new set of documents that bore the seal of the Internal Revenue Service, federal investigators have identified your corruption network as what they classify as a criminal enterprise under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Are you familiar with RICO statutes? Rodriguez's face went pale at the mention of RICO charges, understanding that federal prosecutors were treating his activities not as individual instances of corruption, but as ongoing criminal conspiracy. Your Honor, I'm not sure what kind of fishing expedition this has become, but I've never been involved in any criminal organization. The evidence suggests otherwise, Judge Williams replied, projecting financial documents onto the courtroom monitor. What we're seeing is a detailed analysis of money flows between your personal accounts, private security companies, legal firms, and what appear to be shell corporations designed to hide the source and destination of payments. The financial web was staggering in its complexity. Rodriguez hadn't just been accepting simple bribes. He had been operating a sophisticated money laundering operation that involved multiple banks, investment accounts, and business entities designed to obscure the true nature of his income. Federal investigators have identified 4 primary revenue streams for your criminal enterprise, Judge Williams explained, highlighting different sections of the financial analysis. Direct payments from families seeking to avoid retaliation, consulting fees from private security companies that profited from police misconduct settlements, kickbacks from legal firms that specialized in defending corrupt officers, and what appear to be shares in investment funds that bet against civil rights lawsuits. Rodriguez had been profiting from police brutality in ways that even his victims hadn't imagined. The most shocking revelation was the investment fund connection. Rodriguez had been using his inside knowledge of which police misconduct cases would be buried to help private investors short-sell stock in companies that might face civil rights liability. When Rodriguez guaranteed that certain cases would be classified as justified, investors could bet safely against civil rights settlements, profiting from the denial of justice to brutalized families. Captain Rodriguez, Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of documented evidence, you weren't just covering up police crimes, you were operating a financial market based on the systematic denial of civil rights. You turned the suffering of families into investment opportunities for wealthy individuals who shared your disdain for justice. Rodriguez's hands were shaking as he processed the scope of the federal investigation. Every phone call, every bank transaction, every business meeting had been monitored and documented by investigators who understood exactly how his criminal enterprise operated. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, federal investigators have identified connections between your operation and similar corruption networks in 12 other cities. You weren't working alone, Captain Rodriguez. You were part of a national conspiracy to protect police from accountability while profiting from the systematic abuse of civil rights. The scope was breathtaking. Rodriguez's corruption hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated effort spanning multiple states, involving hundreds of corrupt officials who had turned police misconduct into a profitable industry. IRS agent Rebecca Martinez approached the bench with additional documentation, her presence signaling that Rodriguez's problems extended far beyond civil rights violations. Your Honor, Captain Rodriguez has failed to report approximately $18 million in income over the past 5 years, resulting in tax evasion charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences under federal guidelines. Rodriguez was facing decades in federal prison for crimes he thought would never be discovered. The money trail led investigators to luxury properties, offshore accounts, and business investments that Rodriguez could never have afforded on his official salary. He had been living like a wealthy businessman while presenting himself as a dedicated public servant, his lifestyle funded by the systematic oppression of the communities he was sworn to protect. The financial evidence alone, Judge Williams noted, would be sufficient for multiple felony convictions. But federal investigators have also uncovered evidence of your direct involvement in witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The phrase conspiracy to commit murder hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Rodriguez's corruption hadn't just involved covering up police violence. He had been actively participating in planning and executing attacks on people who threatened to expose his criminal enterprise. But Judge Williams wasn't finished revealing the scope of Rodriguez's crimes. As the financial evidence settled into the minds of everyone present, Judge Williams opened what appeared to be the most sensitive section of her case file. The documents bore classifications that indicated the highest levels of federal investigative authority, suggesting that Rodriguez's crimes had attracted attention from agencies far beyond local law enforcement. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice taking on the formal tone reserved for the most serious revelations, "federal investigators have uncovered evidence that your Internal Affairs Department has been operating in coordination with corrupt officials in the District Attorney's Office, the Mayor's Office, and the Police Chief's administration. This wasn't just individual corruption. This was institutional conspiracy." Rodriguez's face cycled through expressions of panic and calculation as he realized that his network of protection was being systematically dismantled. "Your Honor, any allegations about other officials should be handled through proper channels. I can't speak to anyone else's conduct." "You won't need to speak to it," Judge Williams replied, "because federal surveillance has captured your coordination meetings in detail." The courtroom monitor displayed a new video file, this one showing security footage from what appeared to be an upscale restaurant's private dining room. The timestamp indicated a meeting that had taken place 6 months earlier, and the participants were clearly identifiable as Rodriguez, District Attorney Michael Thompson, Police Chief Robert Hayes, and Mayor Patricia Chen. The audio quality was exceptional, obviously recorded through sophisticated federal surveillance equipment that had been monitoring Rodriguez's activities for months without his knowledge. Their conversation revealed the institutional machinery that had protected police misconduct for years. "The problem we're facing," District Attorney Thompson's voice said on the recording, "is that federal oversight is making our traditional methods more difficult. We can't just bury cases administratively anymore. We need to be more sophisticated about how we handle problems." Police Chief Hayes responded with institutional frustration. "My officers are getting nervous. They're hearing about federal investigations in other cities, and they're worried that their methods are going to be scrutinized. That's why Rodriguez's operation is so valuable," Mayor Chen's voice added. "By channeling everything through internal affairs, we maintain the appearance of oversight, while ensuring that problematic cases are resolved quietly. The families get compensation, the officers stay on duty, and the public maintains confidence in the system." Rodriguez's recorded voice revealed the cynical calculation behind his criminal enterprise. "The key is making sure the payoffs look like legitimate settlements. We use civil rights language, we emphasize healing and moving forward. We make the families feel like they're getting justice, even though they're actually being silenced." The conspiracy involved the highest levels of city government. The recording continued with District Attorney Thompson, explaining how his office coordinated with Rodriguez to ensure that criminal prosecutions were avoided. "When Rodriguez classifies a case as justified force, my office can decline to prosecute based on his expert findings. If federal prosecutors want to get involved, they have to overcome the presumption that local authorities have already conducted thorough investigations." Police Chief Hayes described how officer training was structured to support Rodriguez's cover-up operations. "We teach officers to use specific language in their reports, phrases like perceived threat, officer safety, and split-second decision-making. When Rodriguez investigates, he can point to policy compliance even when the actual conduct was clearly excessive." Mayor Chen's contribution revealed the political machinery that protected the conspiracy. City council members understand that police misconduct settlements are a cost of doing business. As long as the numbers stay manageable and the media coverage remains minimal, they'll support whatever approach keeps federal investigators away. The conversation documented a systematic effort to subvert justice at every level of local government. with Rodriguez serving as the central coordinator for a criminal enterprise that involved elected officials, prosecutors, and police administrators. But the most damning revelation was yet to come. Judge Williams loaded another audio file, this one capturing a conversation between Rodriguez and someone identified as Vincent Marcelli, described in federal documents as a representative of organized crime families with interests in municipal corruption. "The police brutality business has been very profitable for our organization," Marcelli's voice said with casual authority. "Your ability to guarantee outcomes has made it possible for us to expand our investments in private security, bail bonds, and legal services that profit from police misconduct." Rodriguez's response revealed connections that extended far beyond local corruption. "As long as we can maintain the appearance of legitimate investigations, we can guarantee that problematic cases will be resolved in ways that benefit our business partners. The families get paid, the officers stay on duty, and everyone profits except the victims." Marcelli's laughter was chilling in its casual cruelty. "The beauty of the system is that the victims actually help us maintain it. When families accept settlements and sign non-disclosure agreements, they become complicit in protecting the very system that brutalized them. They get a little money, and we get to keep operating without federal interference." Rodriguez's response revealed the psychological mechanism that allowed him to justify his crimes. Most of these families don't understand that they could pursue federal civil rights cases. They're scared, they're traumatized, and they're grateful for any acknowledgement that they were wronged. A settlement check feels like justice even when it's actually a bribe for silence. The recording captured nearly 40 minutes of conversation between Rodriguez and Marcelli, documenting a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond police corruption into organized crime, municipal fraud, and what federal prosecutors would later classify as racketeering under RICO statutes. Judge Williams paused the recording and addressed Rodriguez directly. "Captain Rodriguez, you've just heard yourself discussing police brutality as a business opportunity with representatives of organized crime. How do you reconcile that with your oath to serve and protect the community?" Rodriguez's voice was barely above a whisper when he answered, "Your Honor, those recordings could be taken out of context. Sometimes undercover operations require law enforcement officials to engage with criminal elements. Captain Rodriguez, federal investigators have determined that you've never been involved in any authorized undercover operations. The meetings with Marcelli and his associates were purely criminal conspiracies, designed to profit from the systematic abuse of civil rights." Rodriguez was running out of lies to tell. The final piece of evidence in this section was perhaps the most devastating: financial records showing that Rodriguez had been receiving regular payments from investment funds that bet against civil rights settlements. When he guaranteed that certain police misconduct cases would be buried, wealthy investors could safely short-sell stocks in companies that might face liability, profiting directly from the denial of justice. "The criminal enterprise you've been operating," Judge Williams explained, "has generated an estimated $14 million in profits for your criminal associates over the past 5 years. You turned the suffering of brutalized families into investment opportunities for people who shared your contempt for civil rights." Rodriguez slumped in his chair as the full scope of his crimes was laid bare. He hadn't just been a corrupt official taking bribes. He had been the central coordinator of a criminal conspiracy that involved organized crime, municipal corruption, and financial fraud on a massive scale. But Judge Williams had saved the most shocking revelation for last. Judge Williams opened a new section of her evidence file, this one marked with warnings about graphic content and classified at the highest levels of federal investigation. The documents she withdrew bore the seals of multiple federal agencies, indicating that Rodriguez's crimes had attracted attention from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and federal prosecutors who specialized in racketeering cases. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice taking on the grave authority reserved for the most serious accusations, "federal investigators have uncovered evidence that your criminal enterprise extended beyond financial corruption and witness intimidation. The evidence suggests that you have been directly involved in planning and executing violent attacks on individuals who threatened to expose your operations." Rodriguez's face went white as he processed the implications of Judge Williams's words. Violence charges would transform his case from white-collar corruption into violent felonies that carried mandatory life sentences under federal guidelines. "Your Honor," Rodriguez said desperately, "I've never been involved in any violent crimes. Whatever allegations are being made must be based on false information or misinterpreted evidence." Judge Williams gestured toward her court administrator, who loaded a new audio file that would destroy Rodriguez's denials with devastating clarity. "What the court is about to hear is a recorded conversation between you and Vincent Marcelli discussing the elimination of witnesses who posed threats to your criminal enterprise." The recording began with Rodriguez's voice discussing murder as casually as a business transaction. "The Morrison family is becoming a problem," Rodriguez's recorded voice said, with chilling, matter-of-fact delivery. "The mother has been talking to civil rights lawyers, and there's talk of federal involvement. We need to send a message that pursuing this matter further isn't in their best interests." Marcelli's response was equally casual. "What kind of message are we talking about? Economic pressure, social isolation, or something more permanent?" "I'm thinking something that looks accidental, but makes the point clear," Rodriguez replied. "Maybe a home invasion gone wrong, or a car accident on a dangerous stretch of highway. Something that could happen to anyone, but sends the right message to other families who might be thinking about causing problems." The courtroom fell into shocked silence as Rodriguez's own voice documented his involvement in planning what could only be described as attempted murder. Judge Williams allowed the weight of his words to settle before continuing with the evidence presentation. "Federal investigators," Judge Williams explained, "have identified 7 families who were subjected to escalating intimidation campaigns that included arson, assault, and attempted murder. In each case, the violence was preceded by recorded conversations between you and your criminal associates, discussing the need to send messages to prevent federal investigation. The evidence included police reports that had been deliberately misclassified, insurance claims that had been fraudulently processed, and medical records that documented injuries consistent with organized attacks rather than random crimes." Rodriguez had been systematically terrorizing the families of police brutality victims, using violence to ensure their silence about his crimes. But the Morrison family had refused to be intimidated. Angela Morrison, Tanya's mother, had continued pursuing federal civil rights charges despite a series of accidents that had destroyed her car, damaged her home, and resulted in her temporary hospitalization after what police had classified as a random mugging. Federal investigators had been monitoring the intimidation campaign, using it to build additional racketeering charges against Rodriguez and his criminal associates. Mrs. Morrison's courage in refusing to be silenced, Judge Williams noted, ultimately provided federal investigators with the evidence they needed to dismantle your entire criminal enterprise. Every threat you made was recorded. Every act of violence was documented. Every attempt to intimidate witnesses became additional evidence of your criminal conspiracy. The audio recordings continued with Rodriguez discussing specific acts of violence that had been carried out against families who had refused to accept his settlement offers. Houses had been burned, family members had been assaulted, and in at least 3 cases Rodriguez had discussed arrangements that could only be described as attempted murder. "The Jenkins family refused our settlement offer," Rodriguez's voice explained to Marcelli during one recorded conversation. "The father has been talking to federal prosecutors, and he's scheduled to testify before a grand jury next month. We need to make sure that testimony never happens." "Understood," Marcelli responded. "We'll arrange something that looks like a robbery gone wrong. These things happen in dangerous neighborhoods." 2 weeks later, federal surveillance had documented Marcelli's associates attempting to force entry into the Jenkins family home, only to be confronted by FBI agents who had been protecting the family based on intercepted communications about the planned attack. Rodriguez had been caught on federal surveillance planning multiple attempted murders. The most shocking revelation was a recorded conversation about Tanya Morrison herself. Rodriguez and his associates had discussed arranging for Tanya to be attacked again, this time fatally, to prevent her from testifying in federal court about the police brutality she had experienced. "The girl is going to be a problem," Rodriguez's voice said with terrifying calculation. "She's young, articulate, and sympathetic. If she testifies before a federal jury, it could unravel everything we've built." We need to make sure she never makes it to court. Federal agents had been forced to place the entire Morrison family in protective custody after intercepting Rodriguez's plans to murder a teenage girl whose only crime had been surviving police brutality and agreeing to testify about it. Rodriguez had planned to murder a child to protect his criminal empire. As the evidence of Rodriguez's involvement in attempted murder settled over the courtroom like a toxic cloud, the doors opened to admit 3 federal agents whose presence transformed the proceeding from a civil hearing into the beginning of a criminal prosecution that would dominate headlines for months. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit approached the bench with credentials and documentation that indicated Rodriguez's case had been elevated to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Behind her, agents from the DEA and IRS carried briefcases filled with evidence that would support what prosecutors were already calling the largest police corruption case in the state's history. "Your Honor," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "Captain David Rodriguez is currently under federal surveillance as part of Operation Clean Badge, an 18-month investigation into police corruption networks operating in 14 cities across 6 states. Rodriguez's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, panic, and finally a kind of hollow recognition that his entire world was about to collapse. The federal investigation had been operating around him for months, while he remained completely unaware that every phone call, every meeting, and every criminal conspiracy had been monitored and documented. "The evidence presented in this courtroom today," Agent Martinez continued, "represents only a small fraction of the criminal activity that federal investigators have documented. Captain Rodriguez is facing charges under RICO statutes, civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, tax evasion, and racketeering." Judge Williams consulted a document that Agent Martinez had provided, her eyebrows rising as she processed the scope of the federal charges. "Agent Martinez, could you summarize for the court the extent of the criminal enterprise that your investigation has uncovered?" Agent Martinez activated a laptop computer that projected organizational charts onto the courtroom monitor, revealing a criminal network that extended far beyond what even Judge Williams had imagined. Operation Clean Badge has identified a criminal conspiracy involving 127 individuals across multiple states, including 43 police officers, 17 prosecutors, 8 judges, 12 elected officials, and 47 private individuals involved in organized crime activities. The scope of corruption was staggering. The organizational chart showed Rodriguez at the center of a web that connected corrupt officials in 6 states, with financial flows totaling over $50 million in bribes, settlements, and investment profits generated through the systematic denial of civil rights. The investigation had uncovered evidence of murder, extortion, drug trafficking, and money laundering, all protected by a network of corrupt officials who had turned law enforcement into a criminal enterprise. Captain Rodriguez, Agent Martinez explained, served as the central coordinator for internal affairs cover-ups that protected this criminal network. When police officers working for organized crime committed violent crimes, Rodriguez ensured that the investigations would be classified as justified actions, allowing the criminal enterprise to operate without fear of law enforcement intervention. The federal investigation had uncovered connections between Rodriguez's operation and major organized crime families, drug cartels, and international money laundering operations that used police corruption as a cover for much larger criminal activities. Rodriguez hadn't just been covering up police brutality. He had been protecting a criminal empire that used police badges as licenses for murder, extortion, and drug trafficking. Judge Williams felt a cold fury as she processed the implications of Agent Martinez's briefing. "Agent Martinez, are you telling this court that Captain Rodriguez has been operating internal affairs as a protection service for organized crime?" "That is correct, Your Honor. Rodriguez's criminal enterprise generated over $14 million in profits for organized crime families by ensuring that their operations within law enforcement would never face serious investigation. Police officers working for criminal organizations could commit virtually any crime, knowing that Rodriguez would classify their actions as justified force. Rodriguez had been running a murder-for-hire service disguised as police work. The federal investigation had identified at least 37 murders that had been committed by police officers working for organized crime, all of which had been classified as justified shootings by Rodriguez's internal affairs investigations. Families had been paid to stay silent about the murders of their children, while the killers received commendations for heroism and remained on duty to commit additional crimes. The Morrison case, Agent Martinez explained, was significant because it represented the first time that a family had refused to be silenced despite escalating violence and intimidation. Mrs. Morrison's courage in continuing to pursue federal charges ultimately provided investigators with the evidence needed to dismantle the entire criminal network. Agent Martinez projected financial documents showing that Rodriguez's criminal enterprise had been operating for over 8 years, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profits for organized crime, while systematically destroying the civil rights of minority communities. The scale of the conspiracy was so vast that federal prosecutors were treating it as a national security threat. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights law, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and organized crime activities. Federal marshals will now take you into custody." Rodriguez looked around the courtroom with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his arrest had been planned and coordinated by multiple federal agencies working together. "This is all a setup," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't destroy my career based on illegally obtained recordings and false accusations." Rodriguez's final meltdown was about to begin. The courtroom had fallen into the kind of silence that preceded earthquakes. Not peaceful, but charged with potential energy that needed only the smallest trigger to be released. Rodriguez stood at the witness stand, his face cycling between rage and panic as federal marshals approached with handcuffs, understanding for the first time that his 18-year career of corruption was ending in federal custody. Judge Williams rose from her bench, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the obvious tension in the room. "Captain Rodriguez, you have been exposed as the leader of a criminal enterprise that has systematically violated the civil rights of hundreds of families while generating millions of dollars in profits for organized crime. Federal prosecutors will now—" "You think you're untouchable up there," Rodriguez screamed, his voice echoing off the marble walls with desperate fury. "You think that robe protects you from the real world. But I know what you really are." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow, revealing the raw racism that had always driven Rodriguez's criminal career. Judge Williams remained standing, her posture straight and dignified despite the obvious threat in Rodriguez's words. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the full authority of judicial power, "you will address this court with respect, or you will be held in contempt. Your criminal enterprise has been exposed, your co-conspirators are in federal custody, and your freedom is about to end. Don't make this worse for yourself." Rodriguez's response was to laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that contained no humor but boundless hatred. "Make it worse? Lady, you just destroyed my entire life based on some fabricated evidence and federal conspiracy theories. You think I have anything left to lose?" Federal Marshal Jennifer Torres had moved closer to Rodriguez's position, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon as she recognized the signs of someone preparing for violence. Court security officers were tensing for action, understanding that Rodriguez's military training and desperate mindset made him extremely dangerous. But Judge Williams had faced down corrupt officials before and refused to be intimidated. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, her voice remaining calm despite the explosive tension building in the room, "you have confessed to murder, conspiracy, and the systematic corruption of justice. The only thing you can do now is accept responsibility for your crimes and hope that federal prosecutors show you more mercy than you showed the families you terrorized." Rodriguez's face went through a final transformation, from rage to calculation to cold, murderous intent. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be undone. "You know what? I think it's time someone taught you what real authority looks like." Rodriguez's fist swung in a vicious arc, connecting with Judge Williams's face with enough force to send her staggering backward into her chair. The impact echoed through the marble courtroom like thunder, a sound that seemed to stop time itself as everyone present processed what had just happened. Crack! The punch landed with devastating force, Judge Williams's slight frame absorbing an assault that could have seriously injured or killed someone her size. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, and her glasses flew across the judicial bench, but even as she staggered from the blow, her eyes never closed, her dignity never wavered. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Federal marshals drew their weapons, while court security officers rushed Rodriguez from multiple angles. Spectators screamed and dove for cover, while court personnel activated emergency protocols designed for exactly this kind of catastrophic breakdown of order. Rodriguez stood over Judge Williams's fallen form like a conqueror, his face twisted with savage satisfaction. "That's what happens when you forget your place," he snarled, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom despite the chaos around him. "Just another uppity." Federal Marshal Torres's voice cut through the noise with sharp authority. "David Rodriguez, you are under federal arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, a crime punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison." Security officers swarmed Rodriguez, wrestling him to the ground with professional efficiency, despite his attempts to resist. The man who had entered the courtroom with swagger and untouchable confidence was now face down on the marble floor, federal handcuffs cutting into his wrists, while a dozen witnesses documented his complete psychological and professional collapse. But Judge Williams slowly pulled herself upright, refusing to be broken by Rodriguez's violence. Blood trickled from her split lip, and the right side of her face was already beginning to swell where Rodriguez's fist had connected, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Let the record show that Captain David Rodriguez has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge in open court before multiple federal witnesses." Even in the aftermath of a brutal attack, Judge Williams maintained the dignity and composure that had defined her 28 years on the bench. She dabbed at her injured lip with a tissue that her court administrator had discreetly provided. But her focus remained on ensuring that Rodriguez's final crime was properly documented for federal prosecution. Rodriguez's violent assault had been witnessed by federal agents who would ensure he faced maximum penalties. As Rodriguez was restrained on the courtroom floor, Agent Martinez coordinated with her backup team through subtle hand signals that indicated the arrest was proceeding according to federal protocols. The assault on Judge Williams had been captured by multiple cameras and witnessed by federal law enforcement officials who understood that attacking a federal judge was one of the most serious crimes in the federal criminal code. "Your Honor," Agent Martinez said, approaching the bench while keeping her weapon trained on Rodriguez's prone form, "federal medical personnel are standing by if you require immediate treatment. The assault you've just suffered will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." Judge Williams accepted a glass of water from her court administrator, using the moment to compose herself while processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Rodriguez's attack had been the final revelation of his true character, a man who viewed violence as an acceptable response to being held accountable for his crimes. "Agent Martinez," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying despite the obvious pain from Rodriguez's assault, "I want every aspect of this assault documented for federal prosecution. Captain Rodriguez has demonstrated that he views violence as an appropriate response to judicial authority, which makes him a danger to every official who might hold him accountable." Rodriguez had just guaranteed himself a life sentence in federal prison. As Rodriguez was loaded into a federal transport vehicle, his hands and feet shackled with restraints normally reserved for the most dangerous criminals, Agent Martinez activated her radio to coordinate with federal teams that had been positioned throughout the city. Rodriguez's assault on Judge Williams had been the signal for what federal prosecutors were calling the largest coordinated police corruption arrests in American history. "All units, this is command. Operation Clean Badge is now active. Execute arrest warrants immediately." Agent Martinez's voice carried across federal radio frequencies as simultaneous raids began at dozens of locations throughout the metropolitan area. The scope of the operation was staggering. Federal agents had been positioned at police stations, government buildings, private residences, and business offices, waiting for the signal that would trigger arrests designed to dismantle Rodriguez's entire criminal network before his co-conspirators could destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. Judge Williams watched from her chambers as news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live coverage of federal agents arresting police officials who had believed themselves untouchable. Her face still bore the marks of Rodriguez's assault, but her attention was focused on ensuring that justice would finally reach the victims of systematic corruption. District Attorney Michael Thompson was arrested at his office while attempting to shred documents related to Rodriguez's cases. Federal agents had been monitoring Thompson's activities for months, understanding that Rodriguez's arrest would trigger attempts to destroy evidence throughout the criminal network. When agents breached Thompson's office, they found him feeding documents into an industrial shredder, while his secretary packed boxes of files for transport to an off-site storage facility. "Michael Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice," Federal Agent Robert Chen announced as handcuffs were applied to the stunned prosecutor. "You have the right to remain silent." Thompson's arrest was captured by news cameras that had been positioned outside the district attorney's office, providing the public with visual confirmation that the corruption reached the highest levels of law enforcement and prosecution. The images of a sitting district attorney being led away in handcuffs would dominate news coverage for weeks, symbolizing the collapse of institutional protection for police misconduct. Police Chief Robert Hayes attempted to barricade himself in his office, but was taken into custody after a brief standoff. Hayes had been monitoring police radio traffic when Rodriguez's arrest was announced, giving him advance warning that federal raids were imminent. He had attempted to destroy evidence and establish communication with his criminal associates, but federal surveillance had anticipated his responses and positioned agents to prevent any escape or evidence destruction. "Command, this is Team 7. Subject Hayes is in custody. We've secured approximately 200 case files and 17 computer hard drives containing evidence of the conspiracy." The radio transmission confirmed that federal agents had successfully prevented the destruction of crucial evidence that would support prosecutions throughout the criminal network. Mayor Patricia Chen was arrested at her home while attempting to flee the jurisdiction in a private vehicle loaded with cash and documents. Federal surveillance had indicated that Chen had been preparing for the possibility of arrest, maintaining offshore accounts and travel documents that would allow her to escape prosecution if the criminal network was exposed. When federal agents attempted to serve her arrest warrant, they found her loading a vehicle with what appeared to be significant amounts of cash and boxes of documents related to Rodriguez's operations. The mayor's attempted flight demonstrates the premeditated nature of this criminal conspiracy, Agent Martinez explained to news reporters who had gathered outside Chen's residence. These individuals understood that they were committing serious federal crimes, and they had prepared escape plans rather than facing accountability for their actions. Vincent Marcelli and 12 associates connected to organized crime were arrested simultaneously at locations throughout the metropolitan area. The organized crime arrests were coordinated with state and federal task forces that had been investigating Marcelli's criminal enterprises for years. Rodriguez's cooperation with organized crime had provided federal investigators with evidence that supported prosecutions for murder, extortion, drug trafficking, and money laundering that extended far beyond police corruption. This operation has dismantled one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the region's history, Agent Martinez announced during a press briefing held outside the federal courthouse. The conspiracy involved organized crime, municipal corruption, and the systematic violation of civil rights on an industrial scale. 47 police officers were arrested at their homes, precincts, and private businesses throughout the day. The police arrests were the most visible aspect of Operation Clean Badge, with news cameras capturing images of officers being led away in handcuffs from locations throughout the metropolitan area. Many of the arrested officers had been working regular patrol shifts, conducting traffic stops and responding to emergency calls while secretly operating as enforcers for organized crime. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Communities that had suffered under police misconduct for years watched in amazement as the officers who had brutalized their families were finally being held accountable by federal authorities. For many families, the arrests represented the first time they had seen the justice system work in their favor. But the most significant arrest was still to come. Judge Williams received a call from FBI Director Patricia Morrison, who informed her that the Rodriguez investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption that reached federal officials who had been protecting the criminal network from national oversight. Additional arrests were planned at the federal level, involving officials who had used their positions to prevent federal investigation of police corruption networks operating in multiple states. "Judge Williams," Director Morrison said, "your courage in exposing Rodriguez's criminal enterprise has provided federal investigators with evidence that will transform how we investigate police corruption throughout the country. This case will become a model for federal intervention in systematic civil rights violations." Rodriguez's assault on Judge Williams had triggered the largest police corruption investigation in American history. 6 months after Rodriguez's violent assault in Courtroom 6A, the federal prosecutions had delivered justice with surgical precision that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Rodriguez himself had been convicted on 47 federal charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the judge specifically noting that his assault on Judge Williams demonstrated a complete rejection of the rule of law and constitutional government. The federal courthouse had become the center of national attention as prosecutors systematically dismantled the criminal network that Rodriguez had coordinated for nearly a decade. District Attorney Michael Thompson received 35 years for conspiracy and civil rights violations, while Police Chief Robert Hayes was sentenced to 28 years for his role in covering up murders and intimidating witnesses. Mayor Patricia Chen's attempted flight had resulted in the harshest sentence of any municipal official involved in the conspiracy. Chen had been convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and attempting to flee prosecution, resulting in a 40-year federal sentence that would effectively ensure she spent the rest of her life in prison. Her case had become a symbol of how political corruption enabled police misconduct, demonstrating that accountability would reach the highest levels of government when federal investigators became involved. The sentences handed down in this case, federal prosecutor Janet Williams explained to gathered reporters, reflect the severity of crimes that undermined the fundamental principles of justice and civil rights. These individuals betrayed their oaths of office and turned public service into personal profit, while systematically brutalizing the communities they were sworn to protect. Vincent Marcelli and his organized crime associates had received sentences ranging from 25 years to life in prison, effectively dismantling a criminal organization that had used police corruption to protect drug trafficking, murder, and extortion operations spanning multiple states. Federal prosecutors had used RICO statutes to ensure that the entire criminal enterprise would be eliminated rather than simply replacing individual participants. The civil settlements for victim families had totaled over $180 million, but more importantly, families were finally receiving official acknowledgement that their children had been wronged. Tanya Morrison, now 17 and preparing for college, had become an advocate for police reform and civil rights. Her testimony during the federal trials had been instrumental in securing convictions, and her family's courage in refusing to be silenced had prevented countless other families from suffering similar brutalization. "I used to be afraid of police officers," Tanya said during a speech at a youth leadership conference, "but now I understand that good officers want the same thing we do, safe communities where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The bad officers were afraid of us because they knew we could expose their crimes." Angela Morrison had established the Morrison Family Foundation for Police Accountability, which provided legal support and advocacy for families dealing with police misconduct. The foundation had already assisted over 200 families in pursuing federal civil rights cases, ensuring that Rodriguez's exposure would continue protecting vulnerable communities long after his imprisonment. Mrs. Eleanor Parker, whose grandson Isaiah had been murdered by officers protected by Rodriguez, had become a national advocate for families affected by police violence. Mrs. Parker had testified at congressional hearings about police accountability, and her dignity in pursuing justice for her grandson had inspired similar families throughout the country to speak out about their experiences with police misconduct. The memorial garden planted in Isaiah's honor had become a pilgrimage site for families seeking healing and hope after losing children to police violence. "My grandson Isaiah was murdered by men who thought black children's lives were worthless," Mrs. Parker said, during her victim impact statement at Rodriguez's sentencing. But his death was not in vain if it prevents other mothers from experiencing this pain. Captain Rodriguez's crimes against our families have finally been exposed, and other children will be protected because we refuse to stay silent. The federal investigation had ultimately identified 312 families who had been victimized by Rodriguez's criminal network, each receiving substantial financial settlements, but more importantly, official acknowledgement that their children had been wronged by the system that was supposed to protect them. Judge Patricia Williams had declined multiple offers to join higher courts, choosing instead to remain in criminal court where she could continue protecting vulnerable families from systematic abuse. Judge Williams had received offers for appointments to federal appellate courts and even preliminary discussions about Supreme Court nomination, but she had chosen to remain in the courtroom where she could directly impact the lives of families seeking justice. Her chambers had become a model for judicial activism, with judges from across the country seeking her guidance on identifying and confronting institutional racism in their own courtrooms. "The work isn't finished here," Judge Williams had explained when declining a federal appointment. "There are still children like Tanya Morrison who need someone willing to stand between them and the system's failures. Justice isn't just about writing opinions from marble towers. Sometimes it's about staying in the trenches, where the real battles are fought." The red mark from Rodriguez's assault had long since faded, but Judge Williams kept a photograph of the courtroom assault on her desk as a daily reminder that corruption could be defeated when good people refused to be intimidated by violence and threats. The institutional changes resulting from the Rodriguez investigation had transformed law enforcement accountability throughout the region. The Riverside County Police Department underwent complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership, revised training protocols, and community accountability measures that served as a template for departments nationwide. Internal affairs had been completely rebuilt, with federal oversight and civilian leadership, ensuring that future misconduct investigations would be conducted independently of police administration. Body camera policies were revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed Rodriguez's conspiracy to operate in darkness for years. Community oversight boards were established with real investigative power and independent budgets, giving residents direct input into police accountability measures. Most importantly, the culture of silence that had protected police misconduct had been shattered by the recognition that federal intervention was always possible when local authorities failed to provide justice. Police officers throughout the region understood that Rodriguez's conspiracy had been exposed by a single family's courage in refusing to be silenced, demonstrating that no criminal network was too powerful to be defeated when victims found the courage to speak truth to power. The final transformation was measured not in headlines or sentences, but in children who could walk through their neighborhoods without fear. 2 years after the punch that echoed through the halls of justice, Judge Patricia Williams received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Angela Morrison knocked softly on the door, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found closure after years of struggle and trauma. "Judge Williams, Mrs." Morrison said, settling into the chair across from the desk where the federal investigation had been planned. "I wanted to thank you personally for having the courage to stand up when it mattered. Tanya's assault finally has meaning because you refused to let Rodriguez hide behind his badge and position." The package contained a framed photograph of Tanya Morrison at her high school graduation, smiling with the bright optimism of a young woman who believed the future held unlimited possibilities despite the trauma she had endured. Beneath the photo was an engraved plaque reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied when good people decide to speak truth to power." Judge Williams felt tears gathering in her eyes as she studied Tanya's face, seeing in her expression the same dignity and hope that she had witnessed in countless young people who had appeared in her courtroom seeking protection from a system that too often failed them. The Rodriguez case had become a watershed moment in American civil rights history, studied in law schools and police academies as an example of how institutional racism operates and how it can be dismantled through persistent courage and federal intervention. The federal consent decree governing the Riverside County Police Department had become a model for police reform nationwide, with provisions requiring implicit bias training, community oversight, and transparent investigation of misconduct complaints. Crime rates in formerly over-policed neighborhoods had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement was rebuilt through accountability and respect. Universities throughout the country had established the Rodriguez Study Program, which used the case as a comprehensive examination of how corruption operates at institutional levels and how federal oversight can restore constitutional protections when local authorities fail to provide justice. Most importantly, young people in Rodriguez's former area of influence no longer lived in fear of police encounters. The systematic terrorization of minority youth had ended, replaced by community policing models that emphasized protection rather than intimidation. The Memorial Scholarship Fund established in the names of Rodriguez's victims had provided educational opportunities for over 400 young people who had been affected by police misconduct. Tanya Morrison had graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, earning a full scholarship to study criminal justice at Howard University. In her graduation speech, she spoke about the day in courtroom 6A that had changed her understanding of power and justice. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," Tanya said to the packed auditorium. "Courage is doing what's right even when you're terrified. Judge Williams showed me that one person willing to stand up can change everything. Captain Rodriguez thought his violence would silence us, but instead it exposed his crimes and protected countless other families." The scholarship recipients had gone on to careers in law, social work, journalism and public service, ensuring that the lessons learned from Rodriguez's exposure would influence the next generation of leaders who understood the importance of protecting civil rights. Detective Lisa Martinez, the internal affairs investigator, whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence against Rodriguez, had been appointed as the first civilian director of police accountability. Martinez had been given authority to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from police administration, and her appointment marked a fundamental shift in how police departments would be held accountable for their officers' actions. Her office had processed over 300 misconduct complaints in its first 2 years, resulting in disciplinary actions, criminal prosecutions, and policy changes that had restored community confidence in police oversight. The Rodriguez case taught us that internal police investigations are inherently compromised when they're conducted by the same institution they're supposed to oversee, Martinez explained during a conference on police accountability. Independent civilian oversight isn't just more effective, it's essential for maintaining public trust in law enforcement. The ripple effects of Rodriguez's exposure extended far beyond Riverside County, inspiring federal investigations in 17 other states and leading to the conviction of over 400 corrupt officers who had been operating with similar impunity. The Department of Justice had established the Rodriguez Task Force, which used the investigative methods developed during Operation Clean Badge to identify and dismantle police corruption networks throughout the country. Federal legislation known as the Rodriguez Act had been passed by Congress, requiring federal oversight of police departments that showed patterns of civil rights violations. The legislation provided federal funding for independent oversight boards, mandated federal investigation of police departments with excessive use of force rates, and established victim compensation funds for families affected by police misconduct. The law had been named in honor of the victims whose courage in speaking out had exposed systematic corruption and protected future generations from similar abuse. The Rodriguez Act represents a fundamental shift in how our nation approaches police accountability, said Representative Maria Santos, who had sponsored the legislation after her own family's experience with police misconduct. "We can no longer allow local politics and institutional loyalty to protect officers who violate the civil rights of the people they're sworn to serve." The courthouse steps where families had once stood alone, demanding justice for their brutalized children, now hosted regular community meetings where residents worked with police officials to build trust and prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished in darkness. The weekly meetings had become a model for community engagement, with family members sharing their experiences, police officers acknowledging past failures, and community leaders working together to ensure that the systematic abuse documented in the Rodriguez case would never happen again. Eleanor Parker, now 73 years old, had become the unofficial coordinator of these meetings, her quiet dignity and persistent demands for accountability inspiring others to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The memorial garden planted in her grandson Isaiah's memory had become the centerpiece of these gatherings, a space where grief could be shared and hope could be nurtured. Every family that speaks out makes it safer for the next family to tell their truth, Mrs. Parker explained, to a group of young activists who had gathered to learn from her experience. Rodriguez's violence was meant to silence us, but instead it gave us the courage to stand together and demand the justice our children deserved. The transformation was so complete that Rodriguez wouldn't recognize the community he had once terrorized. Children now walked through neighborhoods that had been systematically over-policed, their interactions with law enforcement based on mutual respect rather than fear and intimidation. The community policing programs established after Rodriguez's conviction had reduced crime rates, while building trust between residents and officers who understood that their job was to protect rather than control. Officer Marcus Thompson, one of the few police officials who had cooperated with federal investigators from the beginning, had been promoted to Chief of Community Relations and had implemented training programs that used the Rodriguez case as an example of how corruption destroyed both police effectiveness and community safety. The Rodriguez investigation taught us that when officers abuse their authority, they don't just harm individual families, they destroy the trust that makes effective policing possible, Chief Thompson explained during a training session for new recruits. Every officer in this department now understands that protecting civil rights isn't just morally right, it's essential for public safety. Judge Patricia Williams kept Rodriguez's case file on her desk as a daily reminder that justice work required both professional competence and personal courage. Every case that came before her bench was an opportunity to either perpetuate systematic failures or create space for healing and accountability. The federal investigation that had grown from her refusal to be intimidated by Rodriguez's corruption had saved countless families from similar abuse, and had demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal conspiracies could be defeated when good people refused to remain silent. The photograph of her courtroom, taken moments after Rodriguez's assault, showed her standing despite his violence, blood on her lip, but dignity intact. That image had become iconic in legal circles, representing the principle that judicial authority derived not from physical power, but from moral courage and commitment to constitutional principles. Rodriguez himself was serving his life sentence in federal prison, his days spent in protective custody, away from the general population that included many of the young men whose lives he had destroyed through false arrests and fabricated charges. His name had become synonymous with police corruption, a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit about what happened when officers forgot their oath to serve and protect. The evening news still occasionally featured updates about Rodriguez's co-conspirators, but his legacy had evolved from a story about corruption into a demonstration of how justice could prevail when good people refused to be intimidated. District Attorney Michael Thompson had died in federal prison during his 3rd year of incarceration, his death attributed to the stress of imprisonment and the collapse of everything he had built through systematic corruption. Police Chief Robert Hayes had been released after serving 15 years, but lived in isolation, his pension revoked and his reputation destroyed by his involvement in the criminal conspiracy. Mayor Patricia Chen remained in federal prison, her 40-year sentence ensuring that she would never again hold public office or influence municipal policy. Her attempted flight from prosecution had become a symbol of how guilty officials responded when their crimes were finally exposed, demonstrating that accountability would follow corruption regardless of political connections or institutional protection. The most powerful lesson from Rodriguez's exposure was that change began with individuals who decided that enough was enough. Angela Morrison's refusal to be silenced, despite escalating threats, had protected hundreds of other families from similar abuse. Judge Williams's decision to expose Rodriguez's crimes, despite personal danger, had triggered federal investigations that transformed law enforcement accountability throughout the region. The families who had found the courage to testify against Rodriguez, despite years of intimidation, had ensured that his criminal enterprise would be completely dismantled. Every person who stood up to Rodriguez made it possible for the next person to speak out. Judge Williams reflected during a speech at a civil rights conference. Courage is contagious. When people see others refusing to be intimidated, they find their own strength to demand justice. The final measure of transformation was not in headlines or sentences, but in children who could grow up believing that the system would protect rather than harm them. Tanya Morrison, now a sophomore at Howard University studying criminal justice, had interned with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and planned to become a federal prosecutor specializing in police accountability cases. Her experience with Rodriguez's investigation had taught her that individuals could challenge even the most powerful institutions when they combined courage with strategic thinking and federal support. I want other young people to know that speaking truth to power isn't just possible. It's necessary, Tanya explained during a campus interview about her career goals. Judge Williams showed me that one person willing to take a stand can change everything. Captain Rodriguez thought his violence would silence our voices, but instead it amplified them and protected countless other families. As evening fell over the courthouse where so much healing had begun, Judge Williams prepared to leave for home, where her husband waited with dinner and stories of his own days saving lives as a trauma surgeon. The faint scar from Rodriguez's assault was barely visible now, but the memory of that moment, when she chose dignity over retaliation, when she let Rodriguez's violence expose itself rather than meeting it with violence of her own, remained as vivid as ever. That punch had indeed become the beginning of the end for a system built on silence and complicity. Rodriguez had thought his fist would teach Judge Williams her place in a hierarchy that he believed was protected by institutional power and racial privilege. Instead, his violence had become the catalyst for the largest police corruption investigation in American history, the exposure of organized crime infiltration in law enforcement, and the establishment of federal oversight that would protect civil rights for generations to come. The courthouse lights dimmed as another day of seeking justice came to an end, but the work would resume tomorrow and the day after that, and for as many days as families needed someone to stand between them and those who would abuse their power. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to step away when stepping away would be easier. Judge Patricia Williams had chosen to stay in criminal court rather than accepting federal appointments, and in staying, had reminded an entire nation what justice looks like when it refuses to be silenced. If this story struck you, remember that Tanya Morrison was just 16 when she refused to be silenced about police brutality. Remember that Angela Morrison never stopped demanding justice for her daughter. Remember that Judge Williams could have taken the safe path, but chose to fight for what was right. The most important lesson from this story is that dignity never goes out of style, and truth always wins when good people refuse to give up. Rodriguez thought his badge made him untouchable. He thought his corruption would be protected by institutional silence. He thought violence would silence those who challenged his authority. He was wrong on every count, because he encountered people who understood that some principles are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Today, Rodriguez's victims are thriving. Tanya Morrison is studying to become a civil rights prosecutor. Angela Morrison leads a foundation that provides legal support to families seeking justice. Judge Williams continues her work protecting vulnerable youth from systematic abuse. Mrs. Eleanor Parker tends a memorial garden where families find hope after tragedy. And Rodriguez? He spends his days in a 6x8 cell, surrounded by the consequences of choices that seemed so powerful when he was making them, but proved to be nothing more than the desperate acts of a small man who confused cruelty with strength. Justice doesn't always move quickly, but when good people refuse to give up, it moves inevitably toward truth. Rodriguez thought his punch would break Judge Williams's spirit, but he was wrong. She showed us that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is refusing to be broken by it, standing firm until the truth wins, and choosing to stay where the work matters most. If this story struck you, subscribe and share it so that more people can see that standing up for what's right is always worth it. What moment impacted you most? Let us know in the comments. Until the next story that proves courage can change everything.